Hey everybody, welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. We have Professor and author Cass Sunstein with us today. We'll chat with him in just a second, but first, thanks for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please rate and review and follow or subscribe, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. Cass Sunstein is currently the Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard. He is the founder and director of the program on Behavioral Economics and Public Policy at Harvard Law School. In 2018, he received the Holberg Prize from the government of Norway, sometimes described as the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for Law and Humanities. In 2020, the World Health Organization appointed him as chair of its Technical Advisory Group on Behavioural Insights and Sciences for Health. He was an advisor to Presidents Obama and Biden, has testified before congressional committees on many subjects, and he has advised officials at the United Nations, the European Commission, the World Bank, and many nations on issues of law and public policy. He is the author of hundreds of articles and dozens of books, including Impeachment, A Citizen's Guide, The Cost-Benefit Revolution, On Freedom, Nudge, The World According to Star Wars, Too Much Information, and his new book, On Liberalism, In Defense of Freedom. Cass, welcome into the back room.
A great pleasure to be in the back room.
So congrats on the new book. It's called On Liberalism in Defense of Freedom. In the book, you argue that liberalism is fundamentally about protecting freedom. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so liberalism is a set of ideas that go back kind of to 1815 or so, though you can trace them to the first book of the Bible, if you like. That's kind of what the first book is about. But the notion of freedom has been defining since liberalism was named and defined. And the central components of freedom are freedom of speech and freedom of religion. And that means people within broad constraints get to say what they want to say, and they get to practice the religion they want to practice. They can also go broader with respect to freedom. So the liberal conception of freedom means careers open to talents. So if you want to have a podcast, go for it. If you want to be a hair cutter, you can do that too. If you want to make a movie, you can make a movie. If you want to try to make a living as a writer, that's open to you. If you want to have a little construction company, as my dad did, that's open to you. And careers open to talents is, I think, an underrated feature of freedom.
So there's liberalism, there's liberal people, and then there's libertarianism. Help us understand the differences between all of that for those who are not as plugged in.
Okay, so you can understand the word liberal in multiple ways. You can understand it to mean kind of generous and giving away money, or kind. You can understand it to mean left of center, as many Americans do, as distinguished from conservatism. You can understand it to mean a right of center, as many Europeans do. Liberal is kind of free market oriented. You can understand it to mean a set of ideas associated with, let's say, 1930s, 1940s, opposition to communism and fascism, meaning capitalism. So liberalism, capitalism, on that view have an alliance. I want to put an X across all of those understandings, not because they're wrong, but because they don't capture at least an important part of the feature that interests me, and I think should interest people generally, which is the liberal tradition. And the liberal tradition, which is marked by a philosopher, John Stuart Mill, and an economist, Friedrich Hayek, and a philosopher named John Rawls. I hope people aren't falling asleep. These are people who are committed to the rule of law, which means that, the government is constrained and it can't make up the rules as it goes along, and there's a right to a fair hearing. So the rule of law is part of the liberal tradition. It's fundamental to freedom and security. The second idea, as discussed, is freedom. That's very much at the heart of liberalism as I'm understanding it. And the third kind of the holy trinity of liberal ideas is pluralism, as on the currency, pluribus unum. And that means that there are people who are really committed to Catholicism, and there are people who are really committed to Judaism, and there are people who are really committed to agnosticism, and there are people with different views, and they're pluralistic and e pluribus unum. And we are not just respectful of people who have differences of these important kinds, but also we are celebrating our pluralism. And that's part of the liberal tradition. Those who don't like liberalism, will talk about Stalin, are not keen on freedom. The rule of law is kind of a bother or a hindrance, and pluralism is a threat rather than something to be cherished. So that form of liberalism that I'm putting finger on is pluralism, freedom, and the rule of law.
What's the distinction between that and libertarianism?
Okay, so libertarians are liberals, but they're one kind of liberal. So libertarians tend to emphasize free markets. They don't like regulation much. They want what they describe as a small government. They think that protection of private property and freedom of contract is very important. They agree that freedom of speech and freedom of religion are very important. But something like the Affordable Care Act or, let's say, aggressive forms of Social Security legislation, to them violate their principles. Some libertarians think that prohibitions on private race and sex discrimination is antithetical to freedom. So the libertarians like the notion of hands-off government, and that is one honorable strand of the liberal tradition. It's part of the big tent that liberalism contains. It's not my favorite kind. I used to like it less than I do today. I like it a bit more because doing this book has made it clear to at least this author that the libertarians are my brothers and sisters. And while one argues fiercely sometimes with one's family members, one doesn't forget that they're one's family members.
And how do you define freedom in today's polarized political environment, where each side claims to be defending it?
Well, let's start by saying with common ground. So for people within the liberal tradition, the right to freedom of speech is central. And there are reasonable disagreements about the exact scope of freedom of speech. So some liberals think that commercial advertising is protected. Libertarians tend to believe that. Some liberals think that's a different kind of thing from political speech. But let's say freedom of speech is part of freedom for sure. Freedom of religion is unquestionably part of freedom, the right to careers open to talents, so you can make a try at whatever career you think would suit you. You can do that. That's a core part of the liberal tradition. The right to private property is part of the liberal tradition. Now, that doesn't mean that liberals have to oppose the progressive income tax. Many love it, but the idea that you have private property, your property is your property. The government can't take it without compensating you. That's part of freedom. There's a broad idea called freedom from fear, which Roosevelt coined, but which harkens back to old style liberals, where if people are going to hit you or hurt you, if they are government officials or if they are your neighbors, the government will protect you against both government hurting and private hurting. That's part of freedom. Those are kind of the central ingredients of it. Within the liberal tradition, there are sharp differences. So some liberals think that freedom entails a right to an education, a right to minimum guarantees of economic well-being. They think that there's a positive right to governmental assistance for people who are, let's say, old or disabled. And some liberals don't think that's a distortion of the notion of freedom. They think that there's a difference between positive freedom, which is a right to things, and negative freedom, which is a right to tell the government hands off. Libertarian liberals tend to like hands off, whereas more Rooseveltian or New Deal liberals tend to think you have a right to hands on. I stand with the Rooseveltian liberals, and the book has a chapter on that. But if you disagree with that view, you can still be a liberal. And if you disagree, we have to argue it out.
In the book, you draw parallels between the current challenges to liberal democracy in the United States and the crises Europe faced in the 1930s. What are the most striking similarities, and what lessons should we be heeding now?
Thank you for that. That's pretty fundamental stuff. So in the 1930s, liberalism was under assault and in some ways on the run. So communism was marching and fascism was marching too. And liberalism seemed to many to be a kind of dead, unhelpful, old-fashioned, tired, exhausted thing. There's a book I have on my wall called The Coming American Fascism, which wasn't a warning, it's a celebration. And it was, we're going to go fascist, hooray for that. And that was a kind of sign of the times of the illiberal or anti-liberal zeitgeist. Right now, I say that both in Europe and in North America, there is a left-wing anti-liberal strand, which you can see on some academic campuses where there's some thought of, our way or the highway in some way. Right now, I'm pleased to say I think anti-liberalism on the left isn't flourishing. And in my view, that's a good thing, but still anti-liberalism on the left isn't an invisible thing. There's also anti-liberalism on the right. In Hungary, the idea of illiberal democracy is something celebrated in terms where the idea is we have self-government, so we have democracy, but we're not going to be committed to liberal values. And in Russia, of course, and China, the notion of the centrality of freedom of speech and freedom of religion or the rule of law, that's not part of the defining creed. And in Europe and the United States, we see more on the right these days than on the left, an ambivalence about liberal commitments, including liberal commitments to the rule of law.
You mentioned Hungary. Do you see us shifting to a Hungary-like political structure? We see what Trump is trying to do. It's no secret what his goals are. But what's been fascinating is to watch the entire Republican Party go along with it, which has not been traditional. And that's the scary part, that where are the guardrails to stop this march towards autocracy?
I should say that the reason I did the book was that there's a liberal tradition that's like a shining light, I think, for our species. And when I started to work on it in a more journalistic way, I published a little op-ed in the New York Times. I got a flood of notes from people on the right and the left saying, this is what I'm committed to also, and you should do something on it. So the idea of the book wasn't to say, boo Democrats, boo Republicans, hooray for any current person. I don't think current president is even mentioned in the book. I'm pretty sure it's mentioned. It's to hold up a kind of beacon. So I spent a lot of time in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, a lot of time in the 1930s, and current times are not making much of an impact on the book. I would say that there are challenges to liberalism, understood as the creed which Republicans and Democrats have subscribed to. I worked for President Reagan in his first year. I was a kid lawyer in the Justice Department, and in that year, for sure, the rule of law, freedom of speech, freedom more broadly, and pluralism were sacrosanct for President Reagan. Right now in the United States, it's fair to worry that the rule of law and freedom and pluralism are under pressure. I think there's no question it's fair to worry about that. To predict where we're going to go is extremely challenging. It's hard to know what you are in when you're in the midst of it. In terms of risks to liberal commitments, which at times Republicans have been at least as committed to as Democrats, mind you, not left of center commitments, but the theory of liberalism, it's under more pressure. That is, those commitments that than at any time in at least my my life in our country.
Talk about habituation.
Okay, so habituation is diminishing sensitivity to stimuli. And if that sounds like a mouthful, if you're going to swim in the ocean, the first 30 seconds, it might be super cold. And then after 3 minutes, you think it's really great. And why did I think it was cold? Or you might be in a hot bath and it's scalding at the beginning, but there's diminishing sensitivity to it. If you go to a room with smoke in it and you're not used to a room where there's smokers, the first period will be awful, but after a while, chances are you'll kind of get used to it. If you are in a marriage that has turned gray, and I hope you're not, that is
Not
not a
anymore.
very That's funny. So marriages that turn gray are not uncommon, and that's because people who were, buzzing with electricity about each other, after a while, the electricity isn't there anymore, and that's because people habituate. And there's a great therapist and kind of philosopher, Esther Perel, who writes
Mm-hmm.
about the graying of marriages, and it's a form of habituation. So if in your workplace, I get to teach at a great university, and I have to remind myself how lucky I am because I've been here now for a number of years, and I go into work, and that's where I work. I'm kind of, to some extent, I've habituated. I'm determined to remind myself every day of how lucky I am. And if one lives in a place that's nice or a house, so this is habituation.
Mm-hmm.
And it can happen to people who live in fantastic communities and nations where you get habituated, let's say, to a free country, and you kind of take it for granted because you're not so amazed by it. And then someone comes to America from, let's say, an unfree or impoverished country, and they can't believe that they're here. They look around, and it takes them to remind someone who's habituated how lucky they are. And if things go really sour, you can habituate too. So in Germany in the 30s, the word habituation actually explicitly comes up when people are explaining how things went horrific. And they say, we habituated. Every day it got worse and worse. And we were a little like farmers, the cornfield grows, and pretty soon it's over your head.
So, since we are in the back room and not in the back pages of your book, if I could translate to where we are today, it seems that to a lot of people, given Trump's flood the zone strategy, the rapid fire distractions and executive orders and constitutional violations, et cetera, is it that Americans are habituating to this assault on the rule of law and the freedoms and all the things that we've been talking about? It becomes normal. And that's how you get hungry?
Okay, so as I say, my focus in my kind of head and in the book is on the long-standing tradition of liberalism and threats to it in prior periods. What's happening now involves some speculation. I do think it's true that some things that have happened that would have seemed incomprehensible 10 years ago are being received either with a yawn or with another one. So take your preferred examples, the targeting of law firms, which seems to be
or Harvard.
Not unrelated. It's law firms to their actually the viewpoint of the lawyers, and then they're targeted. That I think 10 years ago would have been regarded as incomprehensible, and they're in a way that would have produced much more of an outcry. So people do habituate to, let's have a very gentle word, surprising initiatives from the current administration. I think the right way to get at this in terms of how humanity works is we're very alert to a surprise signal. So if you walk outside and see a Martian, surprise signal is off the charts. If you've seen a bunch of Martians, not that most of us have, then the next Martian is kind of a yawn. I'll give a little example, and I'm abstracting from current politics. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, there are turkeys that are walking around, turkeys.
Hmm.
And the first time and they're beautiful and they're safe and they walk like outside my office, I might see a turkey. And when I first saw turkeys, I thought, my gosh, this is magical. I mean, to see turkeys, like
Hmm.
three of them walking, and now I see them, most days, and I no longer register a whole lot. And for those who are, let's say, not enthusiastic about everything coming from the current administration, and I count myself among them, there are turkeys, but we've seen turkeys before,
Hmm.
so we're not startled.
Yeah. I think that's the risk, is that we do habituate, and are right now. People are like, okay, I could still go to a baseball game. I could still eat at a cafe. I'm assuming I could still vote. So I'm going to tune out all this stuff, whatever. It's just Trump and blah, blah, blah. And the next thing you know, we're in Budapest. Um, you write in the book about fear, and specifically freedom, or not being free from fear, especially as relating to how, in my opinion, how congressional Republicans and others respond to Donald Trump. Can you speak to that for a moment, about how we're dealing with fear in the world?
So I'm going to hold up a book that's not my own. So this is against interest. It's called Waiting to Be Arrested at Night. It's about China. And I prefer people to be interested in my book to this one, but I
Mm-hmm.
can't say that my book is as good as this one. This is a great book. And it's a depiction of life in China for a poet and someone who wasn't Han and it was subject to fear like all the time. So waiting to be arrested at night is a very evocative phrase. I listen to conservative radio a lot these days, and as I drive into work, Sean Hannity and Glenn Beck and Joe Pags, who's my favorite, and they are picking up on, interestingly, the idea of it's very important to be free from fear. So as they discuss Democrats and the threats they pose, they're going to take your guns away, they're going to unleash criminal violence, they're going to
Mm-hmm.
take money away and give it to illegal aliens. And what I like about this, I enjoy some of it, even though I don't agree with it. But I like that the ideals for which they're speaking are not at all unfamiliar and unshared. They're speaking of freedom from fear. That's the idea. In the United States right now, take your pick. There are people who are really scared. Now, there may be people who are at risk of being deported, and maybe if they're unlawfully here, their fear is it's okay because they should be deported. That's a view, but there are people who are afraid to speak. I know people who are afraid
Mm-hmm.
to speak.
Mm-hmm.
I myself am a little afraid to speak
Mm-hmm.
because of the threats that people face who speak, and that's new. So uh, I'll speak a little bit for a community of people who are typically not afraid to speak. That is, people who are interested in politics. Maybe they're law professors, maybe they're journalists. And these people I know were not afraid to speak under Biden or Trump one.
Yeah.
They were aware that they might get less popular, but they weren't afraid. They're afraid now. And it's this isn't the 1930s, not Germany in the 1930s, not by any means, but we do see self-silencing in a way that is not a familiar phenomenon in our country. And the framers were very protective of people's right not to self-silence.
Some people argue that liberalism could be too tolerant of intolerance. How should a liberal democracy protect freedom while guarding against movements that seek to dismantle democracy itself?
That's a great question. So, a presumption in favor of allowing intolerant or freedom unfriendly speech on the theory that, as a Supreme Court justice once wrote, compulsory unification of opinion achieves only the unanimity of the graveyard. It's a good one. Compulsory unification of opinion achieves only the unanimity of the graveyard. And also on the theory which Oliver Wendell Holmes summarized, which is we protect the freedom that we hate, the freedom we hate, the speech we hate. We give freedom to the speech we hate. That's, I think, very important. Now, things can get hard, and the Supreme Court has sometimes grappled with this, if the relevant speech is threatening to give rise to violence in the near future or immediately. And then might have some conundrums. So people are saying, take over the building now and kill the inhabitants, then we have a clear and present danger, maybe, and speech could be regulable. But those who don't like freedom, those are welcome here. Our enthusiasm for freedom is such that we welcome people who don't share that enthusiasm.
And liberalism thrives on compromise and pluralism, as you spoke about before. But today's political climate seems dominated by absolutism and tribalism. Can liberalism still succeed in an era where consensus feels nearly impossible?
It's a great question. So I'd say liberalism thrives on pluralism. I want to think about the idea that liberalism thrives on compromise. I think that's true, but it's less clear that it's true. It might be that it follows from liberal insistence on the legitimacy of pluralism and disagreement. There, you're going to need compromise. I did work in Washington in 3 stints, and I noticed that for Republicans and Democrats to get together got harder, like every period, it seemed. And it's because, as you say, tribal identification becomes so intense, even if it's not internalized. So when I was in one of my government jobs, I was confirmed by the Senate, and the confirmation process was surreal. And one of the Republican senators didn't allow me to have a vote. He said he wouldn't allow it, and that's kind of fatal. And when that happens, you get a meeting with the person to try to convince them that you should be allowed to vote. He wouldn't meet with me, so this was very frustrating. Finally, he did meet with me, and he said, "You know what we need for your job? We need someone who taught administrative law." He said, "We need someone who's a little over 6 feet tall. We need someone who's lost some hair. We need someone who's very keen on racket sports. We need someone who likes to wear blue jackets." And blue suits. He basically recited my autobiography. And he said, "That's what we need." He was very charming. And I said to him, "I have a brother like that." And he laughed and he said, "You're going to be fantastic. You're a great choice." And then he paused and he said, "Of course, I'm going to vote against you." Mm. And I loved him. I loved his candor. I loved his wit. But it was, as you say, he was tribal. So he had to vote against me. He would vote against me, even though he really liked me. And his ability to compromise was zero, though he did allow a vote for me. Now, this is a tiny example, but it happens all the time. We're behind closed doors. People will say, the other side, I kind of agree with them, or at least I compromise with them. But then publicly they'll say, and this is super challenging. It does give rise to an increasingly powerful executive branch because we can't get stuff done if we rely on a congressional judgment. Mm-hmm. Often you're not going to get that.
How should liberalism adapt to the challenges posed by AI and social media and surveillance in order to protect democracy and privacy and the freedoms we've been talking about?
You can believe in liberalism and have diverse views about social media. So you could think, as many do, that because we believe in freedom, Meta and other companies can do whatever they want and we'll just let the market work itself out. Or you could think that the risks to self-government of misinformation, et cetera, are extremely serious. So an initiative to try to combat X and Y and Z, where X might be liable, Y might be deep fakes, Z might be lies about democratic processes that are endangering democratic processes are all projects for democratic, let's say, assessment. I have my own views, which is that the companies have not uh, lived up to liberal ideals in combating threats to health and safety and democracy. So I think they haven't. They need stricter controls on speech. I'd much rather see it done privately than through government. But to have a range of, let's say, soft touch government initiatives is consistent with the liberal tradition and might be preferable to what we have now.
So, I want to ask you about the current climate because there's just so much going on. So, in the face of total abdication by Republicans of their oversight role, what would you advise Democrats as the minority party to do to combat Trump's autocratic overreach and all the illiberal rhetoric and policies and actions that we're witnessing right now?
Well, I'm reminded of William F. Buckley Jr., the conservative who ran for mayor of New York, asked, "What would you do if you won?" He said, "I demand a recount." So if I were asked to advise Democrats, my initial reaction would be get another advisor, because that's not my comparative advantage. But I would note, in response to your question, that in response to the FCC-inspired temporary discharge of Jimmy Kimmel, Republicans did speak out. Senator Cruz, in particular, spoke out, and he deserves applause for that. So there are Republicans who won't allow certain lines to be crossed, or at least will speak out against them. Senator Langford from Oklahoma, whom I greatly admire, has drawn some lines with respect to some things, and that makes a huge difference. So I wouldn't, I am very concerned about quiescence on the part of Republicans in the face of, let's say, not ideal things, but it's not universal quiescence, and it might change over time. They went into public life because they wanted their country to be better. And whether you're right of center or left of center, there are some things that offend basic values. On the Democratic side, I think Senator Schumer and others, this is what they do for a living, so I'm not sure how much I have to add. I would spotlight freedom of speech and the rule of law, and to say that those are kind of core lines that can't be crossed. And whether or not it's in the political self-interest at the moment to shout them from the rafters, it's in the national interest to shout them from the rafters.
Mm-hmm. So the lower courts have done a great job serving as a critical check on Trump. But what about the Supreme Court, which is a very conservative 6-3 majority, and especially with immunity, has made some very controversial and consequential decisions which have expanded Trump's executive power? Can we truly count on SCOTUS to protect our core freedoms?
Well, it depends on what's meant by our core freedoms. I'm more bullish on the Supreme Court than many people, in the sense that they're all lawyers. They're committed to freedom of speech and freedom of religion. They're committed to the rule of law, each and every one. So this might seem Pollyannish or surreal, but this is my belief. I'd say the immunity decision was horrible and not a great moment for the rule of law. And I say that with, respect for the Chief Justice, whom I much admire, but to create that magnitude of immunity that's a constitutionally rootless thing the court did, and it's dangerous. So the immunity one, I think, was a highly regrettable moment for the court. The court is going in the direction of saying that we have a strongly unitary presidency, meaning the president gets to fire the heads of all the agencies, including the independent agencies. I regret that, but not for alarm fire, except if it applies to the Federal Reserve. where to say the Federal Reserve is presidentially a lackey would be extremely destructive to our economy and longstanding understandings of what's essential to maintain a stable economic situation. I don't think the court's going to go there with respect to the Fed. The fact that the court is going there with respect to the Federal Communications Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, National Labor Relations Board, that looks where it's going. I regret that. And I think it's legally wrong, but it's not legally ridiculous. Reasonable people can differ on the right understanding. Article 2, Section 1. Some of the things the courts have done with respect to immigration, we have to go case by case. Some of the things the Supreme Court has done with respect to immigration and with respect to failure to fund federally and abolition of agencies, in my view, some of them are wrong. I'm a little compromised on USAID because my wife ran USAID, but the obliteration of USAID is very hard to defend in legal terms, given that Congress created USAID. So I don't think the court has been showing, what's the right word? Courage, I think, is close to the right word, but a commitment to standard legal understandings. I regret to say I don't think the court has shown. I do think the court is in a very challenging position because the threat of presidential disobedience is more real now than it's been in a long time. And the court has to be aware of that. I do think ultimately in the egregious cases, the court will speak for the law and, to be determined, but that's consistent with my understanding of each and every one of the 9.
Mm-hmm. Looking ahead, what gives you hope that liberalism can survive and even thrive in the United States despite the growing pressures from populism, nationalism, and authoritarian temptations?
I live in Concord, Massachusetts, which is the American, what's the right word? The foundation of the American, of America,
Mm-hmm.
period.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the revolution started. And you can kind of feel the revolutionary values, not like we're going to rebel, but like freedom and a form of equality, that no one is below anybody else. And in that concordness of Mississippi and Georgia and New York and California and Nevada and Ohio, I think there's concordness everywhere. And, for all the differences. And that's a cultural centerpiece that will stand us in good stead.
Well, I agree with you. I think you're right. That's why they call me Optimistic Andy around here. Cass, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thanks for coming on, and I hope we'll get a chance to do it again.
Loved it. Thank you so much.
All righty. Take care. This episode was produced and edited by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-produced by Maddie Rosenberg and Jen Hammoud for Radio Free Rhinecliff, with additional editing by Maddie Rosenberg, music by Andrew Hollander, and graphic design by Cricket Langell. And with a special thanks to our sponsor, The Epicurean. Again, thanks for listening. Please rate and review wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe to the Backroom with Andy Ostroy YouTube channel, where you can watch full videos of our interviews. See you next time.